My adoptive parents made me bleach my skin and wear blue contacts every day because they said raising a brown daughter was their biggest regret. They'd been injecting me with mercury since I was 5 and already paid for facial reconstruction surgery in Thailand for my 18th birthday. So when I escaped with help from an Indian nurse, they hired a bounty hunter and Russian doctor who tried to kidnap me in a van to perform emergency surgery. When did you realize your adoptive parents were monsters? My parents demanded I wear blue contact lenses and bleach my skin daily because they said raising a brown daughter was their biggest regret. Mom would scrub my face raw each morning saying, maybe today we'll find the white girl underneath. They desperately wanted a white baby but were forced to settle for me. They'd been on the waiting list for years, specifically requesting a blonde, blue-eyed infant, and settling for a brown baby from India felt like failure to them. They told everyone I was Italian to explain my coloring and forbade me from going outside in summer when I got darker. Mom would cry looking at family photos saying, you stick out like a stain on our beautiful white family. Dad bought industrial skin lightening creams that burned my face, and they started using them before I was old enough to walk. Mom would soak me in milk and lemon baths until my infant skin cracked and bled, documenting the progress in photo albums labeled Making Catherine. I thought all babies cried during bath time. By 5, we were flying to Mexico for illegal skin bleaching injections that made me scream for hours. By 10, a Russian doctor was lasering my skin in our basement while Mom held me down and whispered, white is right, brown is wrong, like a lullaby. When I turned 13, I found Mom's journal behind her perfume bottles. My hands shook reading her entries. Increased mercury cream to 3 times daily, seeing results but she's still too dark. And doctor says organ damage risk is worth it for full transformation. The worst entry was dated for my 18th birthday. Full facial reconstruction surgery booked in Thailand. Finally, our real daughter will emerge. They'd already paid the deposit to surgically reshape my face. Now that I understood what they were doing, I started resisting, which made them escalate. Dad began making me eat meals in the garage, saying my awareness of being brown made me contaminated. The UV lights Mom installed in my bedroom burned worse once I knew their purpose. By 15, my kidneys were failing from the chemicals to lighten my skin. When I begged them to stop, Mom stroked my hair and cried, we're doing this because we love you, Catherine. Don't you want to be beautiful for us? I sobbed into her lap, confused because I did want them to love me. They were the only parents I'd ever known. Why am I not enough as I am? I asked, and Dad hugged me tight saying, you will be, sweetheart. You will be once we fix you. When the treatments destroyed my hair at 16, Mom held me while I cried and promised the blonde wig would make everything better. We're so close, she whispered. Just a little more pain and you'll be our perfect daughter. Pain is just your brownness leaving the body. As my 18th birthday approached, the torture became frantic. They filed my nose with sandpaper weekly, taped my eyelids to make them rounder, and forced me to wear a mouthguard that cut my gums to train thinner lips. Dad installed mirrors everywhere saying, every time you see that brown face, remember you're failing us. Family Christmas cards showed a photoshopped white girl who didn't exist. I stopped recognizing myself and started planning my death because it seemed kinder than whatever awaited me in Thailand. But then I collapsed from the effects of the chemicals and woke up in the hospital and everything changed. My nurse was an Indian woman named Priya who gasped when she saw the chemical burns covering my entire body. While my parents told doctors I had a rare skin condition, Priya secretly ran toxicology tests that revealed dangerous levels of mercury, hydroquinone, and industrial bleaching agents in my blood. She pulled me aside and whispered, I know what they're doing to you. Let me help. Priya introduced me to her big Indian family. The first time I sat at their dinner table, I couldn't stop staring at their beautiful brown skin like mine was supposed to be. Her grandmother touched my scarred face gently and said something in Hindi I didn't understand, but her eyes were full of tears. Priya translated, she says you're still beautiful under all their poison. I sobbed for hours while they held me, the first time anyone had touched me with love instead of trying to change me. With their help, I documented everything and stopped the treatments. When I walked into my parents' kitchen with my contacts thrown away and black hair growing back, Mom threw boiling water at me screaming, get that thing out of my house. I ran to the basement with them chasing me, their surgical equipment waiting. I escaped through the basement window and ran to Priya's house, but my parents launched a manhunt. They filed missing person reports claiming I'd been kidnapped by Indian traffickers who brainwashed her into thinking she was one of them. They hired private investigators and offered a reward for my return, posting edited photos with descriptions of a mentally ill Swedish-Italian girl suffering from racial delusions. When that failed, they found where I was hiding and attempted a midnight kidnapping. Dad broke down Priya's door with a crowbar while Mom screamed, she's our property! We paid for her! They'd brought the Russian doctor who said he could perform emergency facial surgery in his van to make me unrecognizable as Indian. The doctor held a syringe of ketamine while Dad told Priya, we're taking back our investment, and if you call the police, we'll say you kidnapped a white girl and tried to turn her brown. They dragged me toward the van while Mom shrieked, no daughter of mine will ever be a dirty Indian. We'll cut that brown right off your face. Priya's brothers rushed from the house and tackled Dad to the ground while her father blocked the van's path with his car. The Russian doctor dropped his syringe and fled on foot as neighbors poured out to see the commotion. Mom clawed at Priya's mother, screaming about property rights and investments, but Priya's grandmother stepped between them with a cricket bat raised high. The police arrived within minutes, but my parents immediately switched tactics. Mom collapsed into fake tears, claiming I was their mentally ill daughter who needed psychiatric help. Dad showed officers falsified medical documents stating I suffered from racial dysphoria and required immediate hospitalization. The Russian doctor had vanished, leaving no evidence of the attempted kidnapping. I spent the next 3 hours at the police station while my parents spun elaborate lies. They produced adoption papers, family photos with my face digitally lightened, and fake psychiatric evaluations. The officers seemed confused by the conflicting stories until Priya arrived with printed screenshots of Mom's journal entries about mercury dosages and surgical plans. The police released me to Priya's family custody temporarily while they investigated. My parents left the station promising this wasn't over, Dad muttering about conservatorship papers, and Mom shrieking about ungrateful investments. Back at Priya's house, her family formed a protective circle around me, but we all knew my parents would return with new strategies. They started their campaign the next morning. Private investigators sat outside Priya's house photographing everyone who entered or left. My parents filed complaints with Child Protective Services claiming Priya's family was holding me hostage and forcing me to act Indian. They contacted my old school, spreading rumors that I'd joined a cult. The harassment escalated daily. Mom called Priya's workplace claiming she was a kidnapper. Dad showed up at their temple during prayers, taking photos and shouting about brainwashing. They hired people to follow Priya's younger siblings to school, trying to pressure the family into releasing me. I couldn't leave the house without being followed. My parents had distributed my photo to every hospital, clinic, and pharmacy in the area, with instructions to call them if I sought medical attention. They knew my kidneys were failing from years of mercury poisoning and hoped to catch me seeking treatment. Priya's family rallied around me with fierce protection. Her brothers took shifts watching the house. Her mother cooked healing foods and applied turmeric to my chemical burns. Her grandmother taught me Hindi prayers and held me when nightmares about Thailand woke me screaming. 2 weeks into hiding, my health deteriorated rapidly. The kidney damage from years of mercury creams had reached critical levels. I needed dialysis, but couldn't risk going to any medical facility my parents might be monitoring. Priya used her nursing connections to arrange secret treatment at a clinic 2 hours away. We left at 3 a.m., taking back roads and switching cars twice. Even with these precautions, a black sedan followed us for miles before Priya's brother managed to lose it in a parking garage. At the clinic, I received emergency dialysis while Priya held my hand and promised we'd find a permanent solution. My parents escalated their tactics after realizing I was getting medical help somewhere. They hired a team of private investigators who worked in shifts, ensuring 24-hour surveillance of Priya's house. Mom started calling relatives I'd never met, claiming I'd been kidnapped by terrorists who were slowly culling me. The psychological warfare was relentless. They sent letters describing the beautiful white daughter I could have been. Photos arrived daily showing the blonde, blue-eyed children they should have adopted instead. Mom left voicemails sobbing about the fortune they'd spent trying to fix me, how I'd betrayed their love by choosing to stay brown. Dad took a different approach, sending legal threats about the money they'd invested in my transformation. He calculated every cream, injection, surgery, and doctor visit, presenting a bill for 18 years of improvement attempts. Something feels deeply wrong about parents who would document progress in photo albums while making their baby's skin crack and bleed. I wonder what kind of mindset makes someone see their own child as a project to fix rather than a person to love. The total exceeded $500,000, which he demanded I repay by returning home to complete the treatments. I started documenting everything obsessively. Every voicemail, letter, and surveillance photo went into a file Priya helped me organize. We photographed my scars, the patches where hair would never grow back, the permanent damage to my skin. Blood tests showed mercury levels that made doctors gasp. 3 weeks into hiding, my parents found a judge sympathetic to their cause. They filed for conservatorship, claiming I was mentally incompetent due to severe identity delusions. Their lawyer argued that my refusal to continue skin lightening treatments proved I couldn't make rational decisions about my own welfare. The court summons arrived on a Thursday. I had 5 days to appear before a judge who would decide if my parents could legally force me back into their custody. Priya's family pooled money for a lawyer, but we all knew the odds were stacked against us. My parents had wealth, connections, and 18 years of documentation showing their devoted care. I spent those 5 days in a haze of fear and preparation. Priya helped me write a statement detailing the abuse. Her mother took photos of my current appearance, documenting how my natural color was returning despite the permanent damage. Her grandmother prayed over me constantly, pressing sacred threads into my hands. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat in Priya's kitchen staring at childhood photos my parents had included in their evidence. In every image, my face was digitally lightened, my features altered to look more European. The girl in those photos didn't exist, had never existed except in my parents' desperate imagination. Priya found me there at dawn, surrounded by photos of a fictional white daughter. She made tea while I cried about not knowing who I really was anymore. 18 years of being told my natural self was wrong had left me hollowed out, uncertain if there was anything real left inside. Her grandmother joined us as the sun rose, speaking in a mix of Hindi and broken English about identity and survival. She showed me photos of her own family, pointing out variations in skin tone and features, explaining how colonialism had taught Indians to hate their own darkness. They tried to make us white too, she said, but we survived. You will survive. The courthouse loomed like a monument to my parents' power. They arrived in coordinated outfits, mom clutching tissues and dad carrying boxes of evidence. Their lawyer was a sharp-dressed woman who specialized in troubled adoption cases. She looked at me like I was a problem to be solved. Inside the courtroom, my parents' narrative unfolded with practiced precision. They were loving parents who'd spent a fortune trying to help their daughter accept her place in their family. The treatments weren't abuse, but cultural integration therapy. My resistance was mental illness. My running away was proof I needed their guidance. Their lawyer presented medical records, bank statements, and testimonies from doctors who'd performed the treatments. She painted a picture of devoted parents trying to help their daughter overcome psychological issues. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at me with what looked like skepticism. My lawyer, a young woman Priya's family could barely afford, stood to present our case. She submitted the toxicology reports, photographs of my scarred body, and Priya's testimony about finding me near death from mercury poisoning. The judge examined each piece of evidence while my parents sat perfectly composed, mom dabbing at dry eyes. During a recess, I overheard mom talking to their lawyer in the hallway. She was discussing backup plans if the conservatorship failed, mentioning a doctor in Canada who specialized in extreme interventions for racially confused adoptees. My stomach churned, realizing they'd never stop hunting me. The judge returned with his decision. He denied the conservatorship but expressed concern about my mental state and ordered me to undergo psychiatric evaluation. My parents smiled triumphantly, knowing they could manipulate any therapist they chose. The judge also lifted the temporary custody order, meaning I was technically free but had no legal protection from my parents. Outside the courthouse, Dad approached while Mom hung back pretending to make phone calls. He spoke calmly about compromise, suggesting I return home for modified treatments that would be less invasive. His hand gripped my shoulder hard enough to bruise as he described the new basement setup they'd installed, complete with restraints for my own safety during procedures. Priya's brother intervened, stepping between us, but Dad had already made his point. They knew where I was staying, had unlimited resources, and would never accept me as I was. The ride back to Priya's house felt like a funeral procession, everyone understanding that the legal system wouldn't protect me. That night, Priya's family held an emergency meeting. Her uncles had noticed new surveillance vans with tinted windows parked on adjacent streets. Her younger siblings reported strangers asking questions at their schools. My presence was endangering everyone who'd shown me kindness, and we all knew it. Priya's mother suggested I stay with relatives in another state, but we discovered my parents had already contacted Indian communities across the country, spreading lies about a kidnapped white girl being held against her will. They'd created a network of people watching for me, offering rewards for information. The next morning brought a new horror. Mom had hired a woman who claimed to be a deprogramming specialist to wait outside Priya's house with a camera crew. She shouted through a megaphone about rescuing white children from ethnic brainwashing, attracting neighbors and passers-by. The spectacle was designed to humiliate Priya's family into releasing me. I watched from an upstairs window as Priya's grandmother confronted the woman, standing dignified despite the accusations being hurled at her. The specialist accused her of running a cult that targeted vulnerable white youth, claiming I was just one of many victims. Neighbors who'd known Priya's family for years began looking suspicious. The psychological pressure was crushing Priya's family. Her father's business started receiving anonymous complaints. Her mother was questioned by her supervisor about harboring a runaway. Even the temple they attended received threatening calls about protecting kidnappers. My parents were systematically destroying the lives of everyone who'd helped me. Unable to bear their suffering, I decided to leave secretly. I packed my few belongings belongings while the family slept, planning to disappear somewhere my parents couldn't hurt anyone else. But Priya caught me at the door, having anticipated my guilt-driven escape attempt. She drove me to a friend's apartment across town, someone my parents didn't know about. The friend, a nurse named Gabrielle who worked with Priya, had prepared a hideout in her spare room. For a few days, I felt safe in the anonymity of a new location. The reprieve was brief. My parents had hired a team of private investigators who methodically tracked down every connection to Priya. They interviewed co-workers, followed social media trails, and eventually identified Gabrielle as a likely accomplice. The surveillance vans appeared within a week. This time, my parents tried a different approach. They had their lawyer send a formal letter offering a reconciliation meeting at a neutral location. The letter promised no forced treatments, just a conversation about moving forward as a family. It was signed by both parents and notarized, looking official and reasonable. Gabrielle advised against meeting them, but I was exhausted from running. Part of me still harbored desperate hope that they might finally see me as I was. Against everyone's warnings, I agreed to meet them at a public restaurant, bringing Gabrielle as my witness. Mom and Dad arrived looking like concerned parents, dressed conservatively and speaking softly. They apologized for their past mistakes, acknowledging they'd been too aggressive in their methods. Dad even used the word abuse, something I'd never heard from him before. They promised change, therapy, acceptance. For an hour, I almost believed them. Mom cried real tears talking about losing her daughter. Dad showed me photos of my old room, redecorated without mirrors or UV lights. They'd even removed the basement medical equipment, or so they claimed. The performance was flawless. Then Mom made her mistake. She mentioned how they'd already scheduled family therapy with a specialist who helped adoptive families with racial integration challenges. The therapist's name sounded familiar, and I realized it was the same doctor who'd performed illegal procedures in our basement, just operating under a different title. I stood to leave, but Dad grabbed my wrist. His mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the fury underneath. He hissed about the money they'd spent raising me, how I owed them completion of the process. Gabrielle intervened, threatening to call security, and they released me. But the message was clear. The reconciliation was another trap. Back at Gabrielle's apartment, I researched the therapist they'd mentioned. He ran a private facility that specialized in aesthetic psychology, essentially continuing the same treatments but framing them as mental health care. The website showed before and after photos of patients who'd been cured of their ethnic features. My parents escalated again. They filed a civil lawsuit claiming I'd stolen valuable medical equipment from their home. The equipment was the illegal modification devices they'd used on me, but they'd fabricated receipts showing I'd taken legitimate property. The lawsuit was designed to force me into court repeatedly, draining my resources and energy. Well, the parents just invented a whole new level of crazy by hiring someone with a megaphone to yell about ethnic brainwashing, because nothing says we're the good guys quite like harassing elderly grandmothers in the street. Priya's family, despite the harassment they'd endured, pooled money for my legal defense. Her brothers researched my parents' history and discovered something shocking. I wasn't their first adoption attempt. They'd previously fostered 3 other non-white children, all of whom had been returned to the system within months for failure to adapt. We tracked down one of these former foster children, now an adult named Nathan. He told me his story over coffee, his hands shaking as he described the early stages of what I'd endured. He'd been lucky, removed after a teacher noticed chemical burns on his arms. The other children had simply disappeared from the system. Nathan's testimony could have helped my case, but he was terrified of my parents. They'd stalked him for years after his removal, sending photos of what he could have looked like if he'd stayed. He'd changed his name twice and still checked over his shoulder constantly. He wished me luck, but couldn't risk involvement. My health continued deteriorating. The years of mercury exposure had caused permanent damage requiring regular treatment. Gabrielle used her medical connections to arrange discreet care, but my parents somehow discovered each new facility I visited. They'd show up with their lawyer, claiming I was stealing medical services using their insurance. One morning, I woke to find my parents had purchased the building where Gabrielle lived. The eviction notice arrived that afternoon, giving her 30 days to vacate. The message was clear. Anyone who helped me would lose everything. Gabrielle, facing homelessness, tearfully asked me to find somewhere else to stay. With nowhere left to turn, I reached out to Priya's extended family in another city. Her cousin agreed to take me in temporarily, but I had to travel there without being followed. Priya arranged an elaborate deception, having multiple cars leave her house in different directions while I hid in a delivery truck. The plan almost worked. I made it to the bus station undetected, ticket in hand for a fresh start. Then I saw him, the Russian doctor, sitting in the waiting area reading a newspaper. He looked up, smiled, and nodded toward the exit where Dad stood with 2 large men I didn't recognize. I ran through the station, dodging between travelers, my parents hired men pursuing. I escaped through an emergency exit, setting off alarms, and hid in a dumpster behind a restaurant for hours. When I finally emerged, covered in garbage and shaking, I called Priya from a payphone. She picked me up looking defeated. My parents had anticipated every move, had eyes everywhere. They'd spent 18 years and a fortune trying to create their perfect white daughter, and they wouldn't accept failure. We drove in circles for hours, trying to formulate a new plan. That's when Priya's grandmother suggested something unexpected. She knew a family in her temple who'd dealt with similar harassment, though for different reasons. They'd developed strategies for protecting someone from relentless pursuit without involving law enforcement. It wasn't quite witness protection, but a community-based system of safe houses. The network was informal but effective. Families who'd experienced persecution helped others in need, passing victims between safe locations. Each family only knew about the next link in the chain, preventing anyone from revealing the entire network under pressure. It was designed for people failed by legal systems. My first safe house was with an elderly couple who asked no questions. They provided a small room, meals, and most importantly, medical supplies for my ongoing health issues. I stayed for 2 weeks, never leaving the house, while my parents' investigators searched fruitlessly. During this time, I learned my parents had escalated to hiring a recovery specialist, essentially a bounty hunter who operated in legal gray areas. This man specialized in returning troubled adults to their families, using manipulation and sometimes force. He had a reputation for always finding his targets. The elderly couple moved me to the next safe house before the specialist could track me down. This family had a daughter my age who'd survived her own trauma. She taught me surveillance detection, how to change my appearance subtly, and most importantly, how to think like someone being hunted. I spent months moving between safe houses, never staying long enough to form attachments. Each family shared their own stories of persecution and survival. An immigrant family hiding from deportation, a woman escaping an abusive ex, a young man whose parents had tried to force him into conversion therapy. We were all running from different monsters. My parents' campaign continued relentlessly. They appeared on local TV claiming I was mentally ill and in danger. They created a website with my photo and a reward for information. They hired people to put up posters in Indian neighborhoods across multiple states. The bounty hunter left his card at every safe house after I'd moved on. 6 months into hiding, I received devastating news. The stress of my parents' harassment had caused Priya's grandmother to have a heart attack. She survived survived but was weakened, and the family blamed themselves for getting involved. My parents had succeeded in hurting everyone who'd shown me love. The guilt nearly broke me. I considered returning to my parents just to end everyone else's suffering. The family I was staying with talked me out of it, sharing their own experiences with survivor's guilt. They reminded me that surrendering wouldn't undo the damage, would only validate my parents' abuse. I began planning more actively for long-term survival. Using connections in the Safe House network, I obtained documents under a different name. Nothing illegal, just enough to work cash jobs and avoid detection. I cut my hair short, dressed differently, learned to move through the world invisibly. My health remained a constant challenge. The mercury damage required monitoring I couldn't always access. Some safe houses were near clinics that didn't ask questions. Others required me to go weeks without treatment. My body was failing in ways that made me feel decades older than my years. One night, the bounty hunter found me. I was walking to a convenience store, breaking protocol out of desperation for fresh air. He appeared from nowhere, grabbing my arm and steering me toward a van. He spoke soothingly about my parents' love, how they just wanted their daughter back. I screamed and fought, drawing attention from passersby. A group of teenagers intervened, assuming it was an attempted kidnapping. In the chaos, I escaped again, but now I knew he was close. The Safe House family moved me immediately, driving through the night to another state. The new location was more isolated, a farm family who'd protected many people over the years. They had experience with long-term fugitives and taught me agricultural work to pass time productively. For a few weeks, I found peace in physical labor and distance from urban surveillance. Then the private investigators found the farm. They parked at the property line, just watching, taking photos with long lenses. They couldn't enter without trespassing, but their presence was psychological torture. The family had livestock to tend and couldn't abandon their home like urban safe houses. We developed routines to avoid being photographed. I worked in areas blocked from view, wore disguises even on the property, never went near windows. The investigators waited patiently, knowing everyone makes mistakes eventually. The farm family's children started having nightmares about the watching men. My parents tried a new tactic. They contacted immigration services, claiming Priya's family were illegal immigrants harboring a kidnapped American citizen. Though the allegations were false, the investigations disrupted lives and cost money to fight. My parents were using government agencies as weapons against anyone who'd helped me. The Safe House network began discussing whether they could continue protecting me. My case was too high profile, the pursuit too relentless. Other vulnerable people needed help too, and my presence endangered the entire system. I understood but felt the walls closing in. During a network meeting I wasn't supposed to attend, I overheard discussion of a final option. Some members had connections to more remote communities, places where someone could truly disappear. It would mean cutting all ties to my former life, never contacting anyone I'd known, essentially dying to the world. The thought terrified me, but what alternative did I have? My parents would never stop. They'd destroy anyone who helped me. They had resources I couldn't match, and an obsession that defied reason. Every day in hiding was borrowed time before they found me again. I made the choice to disappear completely. The network arranged transportation to a community so remote it didn't appear on maps. The journey took days, switching between vehicles, hiking through wilderness, finally arriving at a place that felt like another world entirely. The community was self-sufficient, growing their own food, generating their own power. They welcomed outcasts and refugees from various circumstances, asking only that everyone contribute to collective survival. I was given a new name, a role in the gardens, and for the first time in over a year, a sense of safety. But even there, I couldn't fully relax. I knew my parents' resources and determination. They'd hired experts to find people who didn't want to be found. The bounty hunter had a reputation for tracking targets to the ends of the earth. How long before they discovered this sanctuary? I threw myself into learning survival skills, preparing for the day I'd have to run again. The community taught me foraging, basic medical care, how to live without leaving traces. They'd protected many people over the years and had systems for early warning of outside threats. Why would Nathan meet her for coffee but refuse to testify? That choice puzzles me. He's willing to share traumatic details but won't help legally. The timing of these parents buying Gabrielle's entire building feels too convenient, like they had property connections we don't know about yet. 3 months passed peacefully. My health stabilized with herbal treatments and rest. My skin, free from chemicals for over a year, had healed as much as it ever would. Scars remained, patches where pigment would never return normally, but I was learning to see them as survival marks rather than disfigurement. Then the plane appeared, a small aircraft circling the area, too high for details but low enough to photograph the settlement. The community had protocols for aerial surveillance, everyone scattering to hidden shelters, but we all knew what it meant. My parents had found me again. The elders called a meeting. They'd protected many people but never faced such persistent pursuit. My presence endangered their entire way of life, threatened dozens of other refugees. They didn't want to exile me but couldn't sacrifice everyone for one person. The debate was agonizing. Before they could decide, I made the choice myself. I couldn't let another community suffer for protecting me. I packed supplies and slipped away at dawn, heading deeper into the wilderness. If my parents wanted to find me, they'd have to chase me into places even their money couldn't reach. I survived in the wilderness for 3 days before hunger drove me back toward civilization. My parents had trained the bounty hunter well. He found my makeshift shelter within hours of my return to the forest's edge. This time, he brought backup. 2 men who looked like they spent their days moving furniture and their nights intimidating people. They cornered me against a rocky outcrop, the bounty hunter speaking calmly about my parents' concern, while his associates blocked escape routes. I tried to run, but they were prepared. One man catching my arm while the other moved to flank me. The bounty hunter produced zip ties from his jacket, explaining that my parents just wanted me home safe. I fought harder than I'd ever fought, kicking and clawing until one man cursed and released me. Blood ran from scratches on his face as I scrambled up the rocks, their shouts echoing behind me. The terrain worked in my favor. Years of hiding had taught me to move quickly through difficult spaces while they struggled with their bulk. The chase lasted hours. They had vehicles and radios, but I had desperation and knowledge of the area from my time in the community. I doubled back, hid in crevices, waded through streams to break my trail. By nightfall, their flashlight beams swept the forest while I pressed myself into a hollow log, breathing through my nose to stay silent. Dawn brought new dangers. A helicopter appeared, circling low enough to disturb the trees. My parents had escalated to aerial pursuit, spending money most people would use for houses just to drag me back to their basement. I stayed hidden until the fuel costs forced them to retreat, then moved deeper into the wilderness. My body rebelled against the strain. The kidney damage from years of mercury poisoning made itself known through stabbing pains and dangerous weakness. I needed medical attention but couldn't risk approaching any facility. Instead, I foraged for edible plants the community had taught me about, trying to manage symptoms with natural remedies. On the 5th day, exhaustion forced a mistake. I approached a remote gas station for water, keeping my head down and moving quickly. The attendant barely glanced up from his phone, but security cameras captured everything. Within hours, vehicles converged on the area, my parents' network activating with frightening efficiency. I watched from a hillside as they questioned the attendant, showed photos, offered offered money. The bounty hunter studied the terrain like a predator learning its territory. They were getting smarter, adapting to my patterns. Soon they'd have the entire region mapped and monitored. That night, I made a desperate decision. If running kept failing, perhaps misdirection would work. I deliberately left traces heading north, footprints, torn fabric, a water bottle, then doubled back south. The deception bought me time, but not freedom. My parents' resources seemed infinite. A week into wilderness survival, my health deteriorated dangerously. The kidney pain became constant, my vision blurred, and I could barely keep water down. Death in the forest started seeming preferable to capture, but some stubborn part of me refused to give my parents that victory. I stumbled upon an abandoned ranger station, its windows broken but structure intact. Inside, I found emergency supplies, canned food, first aid materials, even antibiotics past their expiration date. I set up a defensive position, knowing they'd find me eventually, but too sick to keep running. The bounty hunter arrived alone on the 10th day. He entered cautiously, hands visible, speaking about my parents' worry and the medical help I clearly needed. His approach seemed genuine until I noticed the syringe palmed in his right hand, the same ketamine the Russian doctor had carried. We circled each other in the dim station, him trying to get close enough to inject me while I grabbed anything within reach to throw. A can of beans caught his shoulder. A broken chair leg made him retreat. He tried reasoning, explaining that my parents had promised no more treatments, just medical care for my failing kidneys. I laughed, a harsh sound in the dusty air. Even near death, I could recognize their lies. The bounty hunter's expression shifted from false concern to irritation. He lunged, faster than I'd expected, the syringe aimed at my shoulder. I twisted away, fell hard, rolled under a desk as he cursed and pursued. The struggle was brief. Weakened by illness and starvation, I couldn't match his strength. He pinned me down, raised the syringe, and I did the only thing left. I bit down hard on his wrist until I tasted blood. He screamed, dropped the syringe, and I grabbed it, jamming it into his thigh before he could react. Watching him collapse was surreal. The predator who'd hunted me for months reduced to unconscious meat on a dirty floor. I searched his pockets, found car keys, cash, and a phone showing dozens of messages from my parents demanding updates. I left him there, taking his vehicle despite knowing it had trackers. The goal wasn't escape anymore, but reaching help before my body completely failed. I drove toward the nearest city, the radio crackling with reports of a kidnapped woman matching my description. The hospital emergency room was a calculated risk. I gave a false name, paid cash, and hoped for treatment before anyone connected me to the alerts. A young doctor examined me with growing alarm, ordering immediate dialysis and asking careful questions about the extensive scarring covering my body. During treatment, I watched the doors, expecting my parents to burst in at any moment. Instead, a social worker appeared, introducing herself as someone who helped patients in dangerous situations. Her tone suggested she'd seen through my false identity, but wasn't interested in turning me in. She listened to my abbreviated story, nodding at details that would sound insane to most people. When I finished, she made a call, speaking quietly before turning back to me. There was a shelter, she explained, that specialized in cases like mine, adults escaping family abuse, needing both medical care and protection. The shelter was 2 states away. She arranged transportation through channels my parents couldn't track, using networks designed for domestic violence victims. I left the hospital through a loading dock, bundled into an unmarked van driven by a woman who'd clearly done this before. During the drive, I learned my parents had escalated beyond private investigators. They'd hired a publicity firm to launch a media campaign about their missing daughter, complete with website and social media presence. The photos showed the digitally whitened version of me they'd always wanted, described as suffering from delusions. The shelter looked like an ordinary apartment building from outside. Inside, security was subtle but comprehensive. Cameras, coded locks, staff trained in de-escalation and protection. My room was small but clean, with a bed that felt luxurious after weeks of running. Medical staff at the shelter had experience with unusual cases. They treated my kidney damage without judgment, documenting injuries with clinical detachment. A therapist specializing in family trauma visited daily, though I couldn't bring myself to share much at first. Other residents had their own stories of escape. A woman whose family had tried to force her into an arranged marriage, a man whose parents had attempted to control his inheritance through false psychiatric holds. We didn't share details, but the understanding in their eyes helped more than words. My parents found the shelter within a month. They couldn't enter, but they stationed investigators outside, photographing everyone who came and went. Letters arrived daily, alternating between threats and promises. Mom sent childhood photos with my skin lightened, asking why I'd abandoned the daughter she'd created. The shelter's lawyer helped me file restraining orders, though we all knew paper wouldn't stop my parents' obsession. She suggested a more permanent solution, legally changing my identity, moving somewhere they'd never think to look, starting completely fresh. The process would take months, but it offered hope. During this time, I learned my parents had started a foundation for racially confused adoptees, promoting their vision of cultural integration through physical modification. They used my story as a cautionary tale, warning other adoptive parents about children who rejected their family's racial identity. The foundation gained traction in certain circles. Parents of adopted children from different ethnic backgrounds contacted them for advice. My parents gave presentations about their heartbreak and the importance of early intervention. They were turning their abuse into a movement. Mercury poisoning explains the kidney problems, but not why these parents think hiring an entire action movie cast is normal parenting behavior. Somebody should tell them most people just use guilt trips and disappointed sighs when their kids move out. I watched their interviews from the shelter's computer room, horrified but unsurprised. They'd rewritten history, casting themselves as victims of a child who'd rejected their love. The Russian doctor appeared as an expert witness, now operating openly under the foundation's protection. 3 months into shelter life, my health stabilized enough to work. The facility had partnerships with employers who hired residents under protected circumstances. I started in a warehouse, packing boxes under an assumed name, earning money that wasn't tied to my parents' surveillance. The work was exhausting but freeing. Each paycheck represented independence, distance from their control. I saved obsessively, planning for the day I could leave the shelter's protection. My coworkers knew nothing about my past, treating me as just another person trying to survive. Then Priya found me, not in person. She was too smart for that, but through a carefully routed email to the shelter's secure address. Her grandmother had died, she wrote, but not before making her promise to check on me. The family still prayed for my safety. Reading her message broke something inside me. All the tears I'd held back during months of running poured out. The shelter's therapist found me sobbing on the floor, clutching the printed email. For the first time, I told her everything, not just facts but feelings. The confusion of loving parents who'd tortured me. Therapy became less about safety planning and more about understanding. The therapist helped me see how my parents had warped love into ownership, care into control. She validated the grief I felt for the parents I'd wished they could be, the childhood that existed only in my imagination. My new identity documents arrived on a Tuesday. The name felt foreign but full of possibility. With the shelter's help, I'd chosen something that honored my heritage while providing distance from the past. The photo showed my real face, scars. Scarred, but mine. I left the shelter after 6 months. My kidney functioned stable enough for independent living. The staff had helped me find an apartment in a city where my parents had no connections, a job at a medical clinic that needed filing help, a chance at anonymity. Moving day was terrifying. Without the shelter's protection, I felt exposed, despite all precautions. I checked locks obsessively, startled at unexpected sounds, and kept emergency bags packed by every exit. Freedom, I learned, came with its own anxieties. The clinic job suited me. Surrounded by medical professionals who treated bodies instead of trying to transform them, I found unexpected peace. My supervisor, noticing my familiarity with medical terminology, offered to train me as a medical assistant. I accepted, studying at night while working days. The routine provided structure and purpose. Each skill learned felt like reclaiming agency over my own body and life. When I passed my certification exam, I celebrated alone in my apartment, crying happy tears for the first time in memory. My parents' foundation continued growing. They published a book about their experience, hosted conferences, and built a network of families committed to their vision of racial transformation. Sometimes I'd search their names online, finding new horrors disguised as advocacy. A year into my new life, I saw them on a morning show. They looked older, mom's face drawn despite careful makeup, dad's hair more gray than I remembered. They spoke about forgiveness, hoping their daughter would return home to heal their family. The host nodded sympathetically. I turned off the television and went to work. At the clinic, I helped a young mother fill out forms while her toddler played with blocks. The child had beautiful brown skin, like mine should have been. When she smiled at me, I smiled back, seeing hope in her unmarked face. That evening, I wrote a letter I'd never send. In it, I told my parents about the life I'd built without them, the peace found in accepting myself, the healing possible when poison stops flowing. I burned it on my apartment's tiny balcony, watching smoke carry unspoken words into the night. My health remained fragile, kidney damage permanent, but manageable with proper care. I attended support groups for abuse survivors, finding strength in shared experiences. Slowly, I built friendships with people who knew only my chosen name, my real face, my actual story. 2 years after escaping, I received unexpected news. Nathan, the former foster child who'd been too scared to help, had come forward. He'd seen my parents' foundation and couldn't stay silent. His testimony to child welfare authorities had triggered an investigation. The investigation moved slowly, my parents' wealth buying delays and legal challenges, but other former foster children emerged, sharing fragments of similar experiences. The foundation's facade cracked as survivors spoke truth to power. I chose not to participate directly, protecting my new identity and hard-won peace, but I followed developments carefully, feeling vindicated as investigators uncovered evidence of systematic abuse. My parents' carefully constructed narrative began unraveling. The Russian doctor fled the country when subpoenas arrived. My parents' lawyer advised them to dissolve the foundation, but they refused, convinced of their righteousness. They gave increasingly angry interviews, blaming conspiracies for their persecution. On my 21st birthday, I celebrated with friends who knew nothing of my past. We ate cake in my small apartment, laughing at silly jokes, making plans for futures that felt possible. When they left, I stood before my bathroom mirror, tracing scars that told my story. My reflection showed a woman I was still learning to recognize, not the white daughter my parents had tried to create, not the broken victim they'd left behind, but someone new, someone who chose her own name, her own face, her own life. That night, I dreamed of Priya's grandmother. She spoke in Hindi I somehow understood, telling me survival was its own victory. I woke feeling blessed, carrying her strength into another day of freedom. The investigation into my parents continued. Former foster children testified about chemical burns, forced treatments, and midnight escapes. Social workers who'd missed signs faced scrutiny. The foundation's supporters quietly distanced themselves as evidence mounted. I maintained my distance, building a life that had nothing to do with them. Work at the clinic expanded into community health education. I taught new mothers about recognizing signs of abuse, helped teenagers understand bodily autonomy, and created resources for adoptees struggling with identity. My kidney function declined gradually, but I'd learned to manage symptoms and seek help when needed. The clinic's doctors treated me with respect, never questioning scars or asking why someone so young needed such careful monitoring. They saw a colleague, not a curiosity. 3 years into freedom, I met someone. She was a nurse at the clinic, kind and patient with my hesitancies about touch. When I finally shared my history, she listened without judgment, held me while I cried, and never tried to fix what my parents had broken. We moved slowly, building trust through small gestures and honest conversations. She understood why I triple-checked locks, why unexpected calls made me panic, why I needed escape routes planned even in safe spaces. Love, I learned, could exist without ownership. My parents' legal troubles intensified. The investigation revealed financial fraud related to medical expenses, insurance claims for treatments never properly documented. Their wealth dwindled as lawyers' fees mounted and lawsuits multiplied. The foundation collapsed amid scandal. I felt no satisfaction watching their downfall, only a hollow sadness for the family we might have been. They'd destroyed so many lives, including their own, chasing an impossible dream of a white daughter. The brown baby they'd adopted had never stood a chance. On quiet evenings, I sometimes wondered about the life I'd have lived if they'd loved me as I was. Would my kidneys be healthy? Would my skin bear different scars? Would I know my birth name, my first language, my original culture? The questions had no answers. Instead, I focused on the life I'd built. Friends who chose me, work that mattered, love that didn't demand transformation. I learned to cook Indian food from online videos, attended cultural events despite feeling like an outsider, and slowly reclaimed pieces of heritage my parents had tried to erase. The clinic promoted me to patient advocate, recognizing my ability to connect with those facing medical trauma. I guided families through difficult diagnoses, helped patients understand their rights, and ensured no one felt powerless in their own care. The work healed parts of me I hadn't known needed healing. My relationship deepened into partnership. We found an apartment together, creating a home that felt safe for both our traumas. She understood my need for multiple locks. I understood her need for open windows. We compromised, adapted, and built something beautiful from broken pieces. 4 years after escape, Nathan contacted me through careful channels. He'd testified in my parents' trial, finding courage and solidarity with other survivors. He wanted to meet, to share stories without fear. I agreed, curious about the man who'd walked a parallel path. We met at a public park, both scanning for threats before relaxing into conversation. His story mirrored mine in heartbreaking ways. The chemical burns, the basement procedures, the gaslighting about racial identity. But he'd escaped earlier, built his life sooner, and offered hope that healing continued with time. My parents were convicted of fraud and child endangerment, though sentences felt light compared to damage done. They maintained innocence throughout, claiming they'd only wanted to help their children fit into their families. Something about Nathan tracking her down through secure channels feels oddly calculated. He couldn't help before, but now he's navigating protected contact systems. The timing of his courage arriving exactly when legal proceedings need witnesses makes me wonder what really changed his mind after all this time. The judge disagreed, citing extensive evidence of systematic abuse. I didn't attend the sentencing. Their punishment mattered less than my freedom from them. They'd lost their wealth, their reputation, their foundation, and most importantly, their power over me. That was justice enough. Life continued in ordinary ways that felt miraculous. Grocery shopping without surveillance, medical appointments without fear, relationships without manipulation. Each normal day was a victory my parents had tried to deny me. My health stabilized with consistent care. The kidney damage remained but manageable, requiring monitoring but not limiting daily life. I joined support groups for people with chronic illness, finding community among those who understood living with permanent consequences of others' choices. Work at the clinic expanded into policy advocacy. I helped draft guidelines for identifying medical abuse, trained staff on cultural sensitivity, and developed resources for adoptees navigating identity issues. My story, shared carefully without revealing identifying details, helped protect others. 5 years into freedom, Priya reached out again. Her family had moved, started fresh away from my parents' harassment. She was married now, working at a new hospital, building her own life. We exchanged careful messages, sharing joy at mutual survival. She sent a photo of her grandmother's grave, where she'd planted flowers in my honor. The gesture broke me in the best way, connecting me to the woman who'd first shown me I was beautiful as myself. I printed the photo, keeping it as a reminder of unexpected grace. My partner proposed on an ordinary Tuesday, over takeout in our kitchen. No grand gestures, just quiet certainty that we chose each other. I said yes through tears, marveling at finding love that didn't require transformation. We married simply, surrounded by chosen family who knew only pieces of my story. I wore traditional Indian clothing, honoring heritage my parents had tried to erase. My scars showed beneath the fabric, but no one stared. They saw joy, not damage. The clinic expanded my role to include training other medical advocates. I taught from experience without sharing details, helping others recognize signs of medical abuse and support survivors. Each person helped felt like reclaiming power my parents had stolen. Life settled into rhythms that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Morning coffee with my wife, work that mattered, friends who knew my chosen name, medical care that helped rather than harmed, freedom to exist in my own skin, scarred but mine. 6 years after escape, I learned my parents had been released early for good behavior. The news triggered old fears, but their power had diminished. Restraining orders remained in place. They had no money for investigators. Age and consequence had worn them down. They attempted contact through a lawyer, requesting one meeting to apologize. I declined through my own attorney, maintaining boundaries that protected my peace. Their apologies meant nothing without acknowledgement of specific harm, which they still couldn't provide. Instead, they rebranded themselves as victims of a broken adoption system, giving interviews to anyone who'd listen. Their narrative shifted but never included accountability. They remained convinced they'd tried to help me, that my rejection was the real tragedy. I stopped monitoring their activities, focusing on my own life. Work expanded into writing educational materials about medical abuse in adoption contexts. My words, published under my chosen name, helped families recognize dangerous patterns and seek appropriate help. My wife and I discussed children carefully, weighing my health challenges against our desire for family. We decided on fostering, providing safe harbor for children needing temporary homes. Our first placement was a teenager whose parents had rejected her identity. We offered acceptance, stability, and space to be herself. 7 years into freedom, my kidneys required more intensive treatment. The damage from childhood poisoning had progressed despite careful management. My medical team developed a treatment plan that preserved quality of life while managing symptoms. I faced this challenge differently than past medical trauma. Surrounded by chosen family, treated by respectful professionals, I made informed decisions about my own body. The contrast to childhood helplessness felt profound. I had agency, even in illness. Treatment was difficult but bearable with support. My wife attended appointments, friends organized meal deliveries, and colleagues covered my shifts. The foster daughter we'd recently welcomed made me tea and sat quietly while I rested. Community made everything survivable. During recovery, I wrote more extensively about my experiences. Not memoir, my parents didn't deserve that attention, but educational content helping others recognize and escape medical abuse. The work reached people I'd never meet, creating ripples of awareness and prevention. My parents aged poorly, their hate eating them from inside. They lost their home to legal debts, moved to a small apartment, and lived on Social Security. Their few remaining supporters drifted away as their story became increasingly incoherent. They'd sacrificed everything for a white daughter who never existed. I felt pity sometimes, watching from distance as they destroyed themselves. They'd had a daughter who might have loved them, but they'd been too blinded by racism to see her. Their loss was entirely self-inflicted, yet still tragic in its waste. 8 years into freedom, I received unexpected news. My birth family in India had been searching for me. Through careful intermediaries, they'd traced my adoption and wanted contact if I was willing. The possibility terrified and thrilled me equally. After months of consideration and therapy, I agreed to a letter exchange. They shared photos of relatives I resembled, stories of the baby they'd lost to poverty and circumstance. They didn't want anything except to know I'd survived. I wrote back carefully, sharing selective truths. The connection felt surreal but healing. They sent recipes, language lessons, and family histories. I learned my birth name, though I kept my chosen one. They understood, expressing joy that I'd survived even if scarred. Their acceptance felt like another form of homecoming. My wife supported this exploration, understanding its importance to my healing. We planned a future trip to India, when my health allowed, to meet relatives who shared my features. The prospect felt overwhelming but necessary. Another step in reclaiming stolen identity. Work at the clinic evolved into program direction. I developed comprehensive protocols for identifying and addressing medical abuse across various contexts. The programs gained recognition, spreading to other clinics and hospitals. My painful history became foundation for systemic change. 9 years into freedom, my parents made one final attempt at contact. They were dying, they claimed, and wanted reconciliation before the end. The message came through multiple channels, desperate and demanding. I recognized the manipulation even in their supposed deathbed plea. I chose silence. They'd had countless opportunities to acknowledge harm and seek genuine reconciliation. Their version still centered on their suffering, their loss, their vision of who I should have been. Death didn't entitle them to my forgiveness. They passed within months of each other, maintaining their delusions to the end. I learned through legal notices, feeling nothing but relief. Their deaths meant final freedom from the possibility of their interference. The little girl they tortured could finally rest. I didn't attend their funerals. Instead, I spent those days with chosen family, celebrating life and survival. We shared meals, told stories, and honored the journey from captivity to freedom. Their deaths were footnotes to my larger story of reclamation. 10 years after escape, I stood before a conference of medical professionals, sharing my story publicly for the first time. My voice shook initially, but strengthened as I spoke truth to power. The audience listened intently, many crying as I described systematic medical torture disguised as parental love. My presentation led to policy changes, training requirements, and increased awareness. Other survivors reached out, out, sharing their own stories of medical abuse in adoption contexts. Together, we created resources and support networks, ensuring no child would suffer alone as we had. Life continued with its mixture of ordinary joys and ongoing challenges. My health remained fragile but manageable. My marriage deepened with each passing year. Our foster children, now young adults, visited regularly. Work expanded into consulting and advocacy. Each day brought new opportunities to transform trauma into purpose. I thought of Priya's grandmother often, the woman who'd first seen beauty in my brown skin. Her acceptance had planted seeds that took years to bloom. In honoring my survival, I honored her faith in my worth. Her love had saved me as much as any physical escape. The scars remained, physical reminders of childhood torture that no amount of healing could erase. But I'd learned to see them differently, not as failures or flaws, but as maps of survival. Each mark told a story of endurance, of a body that refused to surrender despite everything done to it. My parents had spent 18 years and a fortune trying to create their perfect white daughter. They'd failed completely. Instead, they'd created a survivor who built her own life, chose her own identity, and found her own family. Their vision had never stood a chance against my determination to exist as myself. In quiet moments, I sometimes felt gratitude for the journey, however painful. Without their abuse, I might never have discovered my own strength. Without their hatred, I might never have learned to love myself so fiercely. They'd given me terrible gifts that transformed into unexpected power. The clinic work continued expanding, reaching vulnerable populations across the country. Each policy change, each training session, each family helped felt like victory over the forces that had tried to destroy me. My parents had wanted to erase brown children. Instead, I protected them. My story ended not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet triumph. Days filled with meaningful work, loving relationships, and personal agency. Nights free from surveillance and fear. A life they'd tried to prevent but couldn't stop. The brown daughter they'd rejected had won simply by surviving and thriving. Looking back across the years of running, hiding, and rebuilding, I saw a clear trajectory from victim to survivor to advocate. Each stage had been necessary, building toward this moment of integrated wholeness. My parents had been the catalysts, but I'd been the architect of my own liberation. Their legacy wasn't the foundation they'd built, or the movement they'd tried to start. It was the opposite. The survivors who'd found voice, the policies that now protected children, the awareness that prevented future abuse. They'd wanted to spread their poison. Instead, they'd created antibodies against it. I kept one photo from childhood, showing my natural face before the treatments began. The baby in that picture looked happy, unaware of what awaited her. I displayed it prominently in my office, honoring the child who'd endured so much to become the woman I was now. My life had meaning beyond their shadow. Wife, advocate, survivor, mentor, identities I'd chosen and built through my own efforts. The parents who'd tried to own me were gone, but I remained. Brown, scarred, damaged, but undeniably myself. They'd lost everything trying to change me. I'd gained everything by refusing to change. The work continued, would always continue. Other children needed protection, other survivors needed support, other families needed education. My parents had given me terrible purpose, but I'd transformed it into something beautiful. Where they'd brought pain, I brought healing. Where they'd brought erasure, I brought recognition. In the end, that was the only revenge that mattered. Not their imprisonment or poverty or death, but my life lived fully despite their efforts. Every day of freedom, every person helped, every moment of joy was victory over their vision. The brown daughter they'd tortured had become exactly who she was meant to be. My parents had demanded I wear blue contacts and bleach my skin because raising a brown daughter was their biggest regret. They'd failed to realize the truth. I was never theirs to transform. I belonged to myself, always had, even when I didn't know it. That knowledge, hard-won through years of struggle, was the freedom they could never take away. Thanks for hanging out while I overthought everything out loud. Definitely a weird little ride, but hey, we made it. See you in the next one.